The basket of bread nearly slipped from Linnet's hands when the old woman slammed the door against her foot. "Go back to the hall!" Agnes Combe hissed through the gap, her eyes wide with a fear Linnet had never seen aimed at her before. Not anger! Fear, raw and animal, the kind that lived in the body before the mind could name it. "Please, your grace, please just go." Linnet, Duchess of Hallowcroft, stood on the frozen step of a cottage in Thorn Hollow with 6 warm loaves cooling in her arms and snow melting through the seams of her boots, and she did not move. The wind off the moor cut sideways, carrying the smell of wood smoke and wet stone. Behind Agnes, in the dim cottage light, a boy of 8 pressed himself into the shadow of the hearth as though the firelight itself might give him away. His name was Eli. Linnet had watched him grow these 3 years, watched him chase geese across the mill pond in summer, watched him lose his front tooth at the harvest fair and grin about the gap for a week after. He was looking at her now the way a rabbit looks at a hawk's shadow crossing the grass, utterly still, utterly ready to bolt. "Eli," Linnet said softly, crouching so her eyes met his over his mother's shoulder. "What's wrong? You can tell me." The boy's mouth opened. A single word seemed to form on his lips, something that began with the shape of a P. Agnes's hand shot back and gripped his shoulder so hard he winced and folded into himself. "Nothing is wrong," Agnes said, too fast, too bright, the words tumbling over one another. "We are grateful for the bread, your grace. We are grateful for everything his grace provides us. Truly, you must not trouble yourself with us." But Linnet had seen something in the half-second before Agnes moved to block the doorway. A bruise, blooming yellow-green along the boy's collarbone where his shirt had slipped, the kind of bruise that did not come from falling off a fence or tumbling down the cottage stairs. It was the shape of fingers. She knew the shape of fingers when she saw it, because she had spent 3 years learning the difference between the marks an estate left by accident and the marks it left on purpose. And behind Agnes, just visible through the cottage's one small window, a man in a long grey coat was walking the lane between the cottages, slow and unhurried, his hands clasped behind his back, watching every door the way a shepherd watches a flock he does not trust to stay penned. "Who is that man?" Linnet asked, though she already half knew the answer, and the asking of it felt like stepping onto ice she could already hear cracking. Agnes's face went the colour of cold ash. Her grip on the doorframe tightened until her knuckles whitened. "Please," she whispered, and this time her voice cracked entirely, breaking on the single syllable like a thread pulled too tight. "If you care for us at all, your grace, you will leave now. And you will never ask that question again. Not here. Not anywhere near these cottages. Please." Linnet looked past her one more time, at the boy with the bruise shaped like a man's hand, at the fear that had swallowed a woman she had known to be steady and unbroken through 3 hard winters of bad harvests and worse weather, a woman who had once stood in this very doorway and laughed at a thunderstorm. Something was wrong in Thorn Hollow. Something larger than poverty, larger than a bad harvest, larger than anything a basket of bread could mend. And she understood, standing there with the loaves going cold in her arms and snow soaking through to her stockings, that whatever this was, her husband, the Duke himself, already knew. He had always known. The thought landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water, and the ripples of it did not stop. "I am not leaving because I am angry with you, Agnes," Linnet said quietly, setting the basket down on the step where the woman could take it without opening the door further. "I am leaving because you have asked me to, but I will come back. And next time, I think you should tell me the truth." The door shut. The bolt slid home with a sound like a small final judgment. Linnet stood alone on the step a moment longer, the cold creeping up through the soles of her boots, and listened to the silence that followed, a silence too complete for a cottage with a child inside it. And somewhere behind her, unseen on the lane, footsteps in the snow had stopped exactly where they could hear. Everything that had just been said, and exactly nothing that had been left unsaid behind a closed door. She did not look back at the man in the grey coat. She had learned in 3 years at Hallowcroft that some things were safer noticed in silence and remembered in detail. She fixed the cut of his coat, the slow, deliberate pace of his boots, the way he did not approach her, only watched, into her memory like a woman pressing a flower between the pages of a book she intended to open again. Then she walked back up the lane toward the hall, her empty hands curled into fists inside her cloak, already certain of one thing. She wouldn't let this go. The walk back took 20 minutes, and she spent every one of them turning the boy's half-formed word over in her mind. P. Pruitt. It had to be Pruitt, the steward who had walked 3 respectful steps behind her at every Michaelmas and Christmas visit for 3 years, smiling that smile that never reached his eyes. She had thought him merely dull. She understood now, with a coldness that had nothing to do with the snow soaking her hem, that dullness could be a disguise as carefully worn as any silk gown. By the time the grey towers of Hallowcroft Hall rose out of the white fields ahead of her, Lynette had made a decision she did not yet fully understand the size of. She would not ask Garrick about the man in the grey coat over dinner, the way a wife asks a husband about his day. She would not give him the chance to close the subject the way he had closed every other subject that touched Thorn Hollow in 3 years of marriage. Whatever this was, she would learn it first, and only then decide what to do with what she knew. She entered through the side door, the one the housekeeper used, rather than the grand front entrance where a footman would announce her arrival and report, as footmen always did, exactly where she had been. No one saw her climb the back stair. No one saw her stand at her bedchamber window for a long while afterward, watching the lane toward Thorn Hollow until the light failed entirely, half expecting, half hoping, to see Eli's small shape come running up it after her. He did not come. And somewhere below her window, faint but unmistakable in the winter quiet, she heard the front door of the hall open and close, and recognized even from 2 floors above the unhurried, deliberate tread of a man in a long grey coat returning home to report. She did not sleep well that night. She lay beside Garrick, listening to the wind worry at the casement, replaying the slammed door, the bolts sliding home, the bruise the exact shape and size of an adult hand closing too hard around a boy's small shoulder. Once, near midnight, she nearly woke him to ask outright who walked the lane to Thorn Hollow in a long grey coat and why a child should flinch at the sight of it. She got as far as turning toward him, her hand half raised toward his sleeping shoulder, before some old, careful instinct stopped her. If she asked him directly and he lied to her, she would lose something between them that 3 years of marriage had only just begun to build. Better, she decided, lying back against the cold pillow, to know the truth herself first, and ask him only once she could no longer be told a comfortable falsehood and believe it. 3 years earlier, Lynette Marrow had arrived at Hallowcroft Hall in a carriage that smelled of new leather and old money, neither of which belonged to her family. Her father, a baronet with more pride than land and more debts than either, had arranged the match with the Duke of Hallowcroft the way men of his class arranged most things that mattered, over brandy, in a study she was never invited into, without once consulting the bride whose future was being decided. Garrick Hallowcroft was 28 then, recently titled after his father's sudden death, composed in the particular way of men who had been taught from the cradle that feeling things loudly was a habit reserved for servants and children. He did not court Lynette so much as inspect her, that first meeting, the way a man inspects a horse he intends to keep for a long time and cannot afford to choose wrongly. She had expected coldness from a marriage built on her father's debts and his need for a dowry large enough to settle them. She had not expected kindness wearing coldness like a coat that did not quite fit him, a coat he had inherited along with the title and had never been taught to take off. In the first months at Hallowcroft Hall, she found him standing alone at windows more often than a duke with a full household should ever need to. She found ledgers locked away in drawers that he visited at strange private hours. Always alone, always with the same haunted set to his jaw when he finally emerged, his color gone grey, his hands faintly trembling in a way he tried and failed to hide from her. She asked him once gently, over a dinner neither of them touched, what troubled him so deeply that he could not sleep through a single night without rising to pace the gallery. He told her, gently but finally, in the voice of a man closing a door he had decided long ago must never open again, that some burdens were not meant to be shared, only carried, alone if necessary, even by a man with a wife sitting across the table from him. Lynette had been raised to accept an answer like that without argument. Her mother had died believing a wife's curiosity was a door best left closed, a lesson taught to her so thoroughly that even now, years later, she could hear her mother's voice cautioning her against it. But Lynette had also been raised in a house with too little money and too many whispered secrets about exactly where it had gone. She knew the particular texture of silence that surrounds people protecting something shameful, the way it sits differently in a room than ordinary quiet. She did not push. Not then. She busied herself instead with the parts of estate life that were permitted to a young duchess still finding her footing, the kitchens, the linen stores, the small charities a woman in her position was expected to perform without ever being asked what they truly cost her in time or in care. She visited the tenant cottages twice a year, at Michaelmas and at Christmas, always accompanied by the steward, Mr. Pruitt, who walked 3 respectful steps behind her, with his hands folded and his expression arranged into something close to warmth. It took her 3 years to notice that Mr. Pruitt's smile never once reached his eyes. 3 years to notice that the tenants who greeted her warmly at the front of their cottages grew quieter, smaller, more careful the moment Pruitt's shadow fell across their threshold. 3 years to wonder, finally, what exactly it was that a man so unremarkable was being paid, year after year, so carefully to watch. There had been small warnings along the way, she realized now, looking back. Warnings she had folded neatly away without examining, the way a person folds away a letter they are not yet ready to read. There was the year a tenant named Walter Hask had asked at the Christmas visit why the Hollow Row cottages never received the same repairs as the cottages nearer the main road, and how Pruitt had answered for the Duke before the Duke could open his mouth, smooth and final, and how Walter had not raised his hand to speak again that year, or any year after. There was the strange, brittle quiet that fell over any gathering of tenants whenever the quarry was mentioned, even in passing. A quiet so consistent across so many different families that Lynette, looking back, could not believe she had ever mistaken it for simple grief. She remembered, too, the first winter of her marriage, finding Garrick in the small chapel, attached to the hall long after the household had gone to bed, kneeling not in prayer but simply still, his head bowed, a single candle burning low beside him. She had not disturbed him. She had told herself, walking back to her cold and empty bedchamber, that a new duke carried many private griefs in the first year after his father's death, and that it was not her place to ask which grief kept him from his own bed. She understood now that she had been half right and entirely wrong. He had been carrying a grief. But it was not only his father's death he mourned in that chapel. It was something he had chosen, every single night since, to keep carrying alone. There was one evening, perhaps 8 months into the marriage, when Garrick had come to her unprompted and spoken, briefly and strangely, about the quarrymen who had died before her arrival. Not their names, not their families, only the bare fact of the collapse, delivered in a voice so carefully flattened it seemed rehearsed. He had said it the way a man confesses to a sin he has already decided not to atone for, testing the weight of the words in his own mouth without ever quite handing them to her. She had murmured something sympathetic and changed the subject, because that was what a good wife did. And she had gone to sleep that night without once asking the question that would have unraveled everything 3 years sooner. What exactly happened to those men? And why does it still sit on you like a stone you cannot set down? There were lighter days too, days she chose now to remember as carefully as the dark ones, because she did not want to let the discovery to come rob her of every true thing the marriage had held. There was the spring he had taught her to fish the mill pond, standing knee-deep in cold water, laughing at her hopeless casting until she finally hooked a trout twice the size of his own. There was the night he had read to her from a book of old border ballads, in a voice gone unexpectedly soft and unguarded, the closest she had ever come, before all of this, to seeing the man beneath the Duke. She held on to these memories now, not as contradictions to what she was learning, but as proof of exactly what was worth fighting to save. Not the title, not the great grey house, but whatever fragile, decent thing still lived underneath 3 years of careful, terrible silence. It was Mrs. Birch, the housekeeper who had served at Hallowcroft since before Garrick's birth, who first taught Lynette, quite unintentionally, how deep the family's habit of silence truly ran. In Lynette's second month at the Hall, she had asked Mrs. Birch idly why an entire wing of the house stood shuttered and unused. Mrs. Birch had answered, after a pause just a fraction too long to be entirely natural, that the late Duchess, Garrick's mother, had preferred the smaller rooms in her final years, and no one had seen reason to reopen the wing since. It was, Lynette understood only much later, the same careful, practiced evasion she would come to recognize in every servant at Hallowcroft when a subject brushed too near the family's buried griefs. Not a lie exactly, but a smooth redirection, polished by long practice into something that barely felt like avoidance at all. The quarry had closed the year before Linnet's wedding. She knew this the way she knew most things about Hallowcroft's past, as a fact stated once, briefly, and never repeated, the kind of fact that sits in a household like a closed door no one walks past without quickening their step. Greystone Quarry, half a mile beyond Thorn Hollow, along a track lined with gorse and old stone walls, had supplied building stone for 3 counties until a rockfall collapsed the eastern gallery on a grey February afternoon and killed 7 men in the space of a single breath. The official record, which Linnet had once glimpsed unrolled across the estate office desk and never thought to question, called it an act of God. Unstable ground, the coroner had written, in a hand too neat for a man examining 7 crushed bodies. No one's fault. The old Duke, Garrick's father, had closed the quarry out of respect for the dead, the story went, and paid each widow a small pension from his own purse, a generosity the county still spoke of. Years later, with quiet admiration at dinner parties Linnet had attended without once questioning the warmth in the room. What no one spoke of, Linnet would only later come to understand, was the precise and terrible price that generosity had purchased. She first sensed the crack running beneath the smooth surface of the story at a christening that autumn, 3 months before the slammed door, 3 months before the bread went cold in her arms on Agnes Coombs' step. An old quarryman named Hob Tanner, deep in his cups and louder for it, had gripped her sleeve at the church gate with a hand rough as bark and said, low and urgent, his breath sour with ale and something closer to desperation, "Ask his grace why the support beams were oak that snapped instead of elm that bends, your grace. Ask him why the order changed 6 weeks before the fall, and who signed for the cheaper wood, and where the saved money went." Before she could answer, before she could even fully absorb the strange specificity of his words, his wife had hauled him away with a stammered apology, her face white with a fear that mirrored, precisely, the fear she would see on Agnes Coombs' face 3 months later. Linnet had asked Garrick that very night, in the privacy of their bedchamber, expecting nothing more than an embarrassed explanation of a drunk man's ramblings. She had expected, perhaps, a small unpleasant truth she could absorb and set aside. She received instead a silence so total it filled the room like water rising slowly through the floorboards of a sinking ship. Garrick set down the book he had not truly been reading. His jaw tightened. And then he told her, for the first time in their marriage, in a voice low and final and frightening in its complete lack of warmth, that the matter was closed, and that she would not raise the subject of the quarry again, not with him, not with the staff, not with anyone in the county, for any reason, ever. She had obeyed. For 3 months she had obeyed entirely, telling herself it was a wife's proper duty to trust her husband's judgment on matters that predated their marriage. She was ashamed now, standing in the cold lane outside Agnes Coombs' cottage, with her arms empty and her mind full of questions, of how easily she had let that silence settle over her like snow settling over a grave, soft, quiet, and burying something that was never meant to stay buried forever. She thought, too, of the 7 names she did not yet know, though she would soon learn every one of them by heart. She knew only from the church register she had once idly read, while waiting for a christening to begin, that the parish had buried an unusual number of men in a single week 3 years before her wedding, all within days of one another, all between the ages of 22 and 51. She had noticed the cluster of dates at the time, and thought nothing more of it than a passing observation, the kind of small curiosity a new bride files away and forgets. She understood now that she had been looking, without knowing it, directly at the wound the entire county had agreed never to name aloud. There was something else she remembered now, turning the lane toward home with her empty basket swinging at her side. At her wedding breakfast, held in the great hall with 300 guests beneath garlands of white roses, she had noticed a small cluster of women standing apart near the kitchen entrance, dressed in black, not invited to sit among the guests, but permitted out of some unspoken courtesy to watch from the threshold. She had asked Charlotte, then still a stranger to her, who they were, and Charlotte had said only briskly that they were estate widows the old Duke had always been kind to, and the subject had closed before Linnet could ask anything further. She understood now, with a sick lurch, that she had been married in the same hall, on the same afternoon, within sight of the very women her husband's family had paid to keep silent about how their husbands had truly died. She did not yet have the proof in her hands, but she had the shape of it now, the outline of a story sketched in fear and silence, and the particular way grown men and women flinched at a grey coat on a quiet lane, and she walked the rest of the way back to Hallowcroft Hall with her jaw set and her mind already turning toward the one place she had never thought, in 3 years of obedient silence, that she would ever need to go alone, the locked cabinet in her own husband's estate office. She passed, on her way through the village, the squat grey church where she had been married, and on impulse she stepped inside, into the cold hush of empty pews and dust motes turning slowly in the coloured light from the high window. She found the parish register on its stand near the vestry, and turned, with hands that did not quite feel steady, to the burial pages from the February of the collapse. 7 entries in the old vicar's careful copperplate, each one recording a name, an age, and beneath every single one the same 2 words, written in identical ink as though copied from a single instruction rather than 7 separate griefs. Rockfall, unavoidable. She read the words 3 times, and the 3rd time she noticed what she had missed twice before. The ink of those 2 words sat very slightly darker than the rest of each entry, as though added afterward by a different hand at a different time to close a question the original entry had perhaps once left open. She closed the register and left the church quickly, her heart beating hard against her ribs, because she understood now that the lie had not stopped at the quarry or at the cottages, or even at her own breakfast table. It had reached into the parish register itself, into the one place a community was meant to keep its truest, most permanent record of who it had lost and how, and someone had gone in afterward and altered even that. Walking the last stretch of lane back toward the hall, she passed the small, weathered grave markers at the edge of the churchyard, 7 of them in a row beneath a single old yew tree, the stone for each one plain and unremarkable, bearing only a name and 2 dates with no mention at all of how the years between them had ended. She had walked past that row of graves a dozen times in 3 years, without once stopping to count them, without once wondering why 7 men so close in age lay buried together beneath the same tree in the same week of the same February. She stopped now in the gathering dusk and read each worn name slowly, deliberately, the way she imagined a person might read names meant to be remembered rather than merely passed. Thomas Combe, Edmund Hask. 5 others she did not yet know. She promised the row of quiet stones, as she had promised herself at the broken gallery later that same week, that she would learn every name properly, and that she would not let the county forget ever again what those 7 dates truly meant. Mr. Pruitt had been steward of Hallowcroft for 11 years, inherited by Garrick along with the title, the debts, and, Lynette now understood with a coldness that settled in her stomach, the silence. He managed the tenant rolls, the rent collections, the small disputes over fences and grazing rights that made up the daily business of a working estate. He was, by every outward measure available to a casual observer, competent, unremarkable, and entirely forgettable. That, she now realized, was precisely the point of him. Lynette began watching him in the weeks after the slammed door, the way she had once watched her father's account books as a girl, searching for the lies hidden in tidy columns of arithmetic that never quite added up to the truth. She noticed, walking the lanes on quiet mornings with no announced purpose, that families who asked too many questions about the quarry pension found their rents quietly raised the following quarter, the increase always small enough to seem unremarkable and large enough to hurt. She noticed that Hob Tanner, the old quarryman who had gripped her sleeve at the christening, was gone entirely from his cottage within a fortnight of that conversation, his family relocated to a parish 2 counties distant with no explanation offered to anyone and none permitted to be asked. The cottage stood empty now, its windows dark, a fact the other tenants stepped around in conversation, the way one steps around a grave in a churchyard path. She noticed, too, that the widows of the 7 dead quarrymen, Agnes Combe foremost among them, lived in the oldest, coldest, most poorly maintained cottages on the entire estate, the ones nearest the lane where Mr. Pruitt walked his slow and watchful rounds nearly every day, rain or shine, as though guarding something far more valuable than rent collection required. She began to understand, piece by careful piece, that the kindness her husband's family was so widely praised for throughout the county was in its truest shape a leash, gentle-looking from a distance, and tightened the moment anyone strained against it. It was Charlotte, Garrick's younger sister, who unknowingly handed Lynette the next thread in the tangle over tea in the morning room one ordinary Tuesday. Complaining idly about household economy and the cost of replacing the drawing-room curtains, Charlotte mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that their late father had spent a startling sum the winter before Garrick's wedding, money no one had ever properly accounted for in any ledger Charlotte had seen, money Garrick had quietly absorbed into the estate's general accounts without comment or explanation when he inherited. Father always said it was for improvements, Charlotte said, stirring her tea with the unconcerned air of a woman discussing weather rather than buried sin. Though I confess I never once saw a single improvement come of it. Not a new fence, not a repaired roof, nothing at all. Lynette set down her cup very carefully with both hands because her hands had begun to shake and she did not want anyone, not Charlotte, not the footman by the door, not even herself in the mirror above the mantel, to see exactly how much that single offhand sentence had just told her. "Do you remember the year exactly?" Lynette asked, keeping her voice as light and unconcerned as she could manage, though her pulse had picked up to a quick, hard rhythm beneath her stays. Charlotte considered, tilting her head. The winter before the wedding, so 2 years before Father died. I remember because Mother complained of it bitterly that Christmas, said it was an absurd sum for improvements no one could point to, and Father told her to mind her own affairs and let him mind the estates. She laughed, a small, careless sound. He was always rather short with her when money was mentioned. I never thought much of it. Fathers are short about money. It is practically their occupation. Lynette asked no further questions that afternoon, though every instinct in her strained toward them. She had learned enough, in 3 years of watching Mr. Pruitt's careful smile, to know that the wrong question asked too eagerly could close a door just as surely as the right question asked too late could leave it shut forever. Instead, she finished her tea, complimented Charlotte's choice of curtain fabric, and excused herself to the morning room window, where she stood for a long while watching the lane that led, eventually past the edge of the estate toward Thorn Hollow, and beyond it, toward the dark mouth of a quarry that had not produced a single block of stone in 3 years. That night, she lay awake beside Garrick long after his breathing had slowed into sleep, and she studied his profile in the dim light of the banked fire. The same composed, careful face she had married, the face that had never once, in 3 years, let her see what truly lay beneath it. She thought of Eli's bruise, of Hob Tanner's missing family, of the strange notation Charlotte had unknowingly handed her, an unaccounted sum spent the winter before a wedding no one could quite explain. The pieces were beginning to arrange themselves into a shape she did not yet want to see clearly, and she understood, lying there in the dark beside a husband she still loved despite everything, that there would be no comfortable way to finish assembling it. She rose before dawn the next morning, before even the kitchen maids had stirred the banked fires back to life, and walked alone to the housekeeper's pantry, where the keys to every locked room in Hallowcroft Hall hung on a row of brass hooks behind the flower bins, sorted and labelled in the housekeeper's careful hand. She had passed that row of hooks 100 times in 3 years without once truly seeing it. Now she stood before it in the grey half-light, reading each small ivory tag until she found the one marked simply Estate Office Cabinet in handwriting that had not been disturbed, judging by the thin film of dust along its edge, in a very long while. She lifted it from the hook without a sound, the iron cold and unfamiliar in her palm, and slipped it into the pocket of her morning gown, and stood there a moment longer in the quiet kitchen, feeling for the first time in 3 years of careful obedience the particular and frightening weight of a decision she could not later take back. She did not go directly to the office that morning. She made herself wait, made herself sit through breakfast with Garrick and Charlotte as though it were any ordinary day, made herself smile at Charlotte's idle chatter about curtain fabric, and nod along to Garrick's brief account of a letter from his man of business in Carlisle, all while the cold iron key sat against her hip like a small, patient secret. She had learned in 3 years of estate life that the most important things were rarely done in haste. Whatever waited in that locked cabinet would still be there at midnight, undisturbed, and she would face it with a clearer head and a steadier hand than she trusted herself to have in the raw, unsettled hours just after dawn. She spent that long, ordinary day moving through the house as though nothing at all had changed, though everything in her had quietly rearranged itself around the key in her pocket. She approved the week's menus with the cook. She sat with the housekeeper over the linen accounts. She walked, as she always did on fine afternoons, the short distance to the kitchen garden, and found herself standing longer than usual at the low stone wall that looked out over the fields toward Thorn Hollow, watching smoke rise thin and grey from a dozen distant chimneys, wondering how many of those small fires warmed a family that had once been made to sign away the truth of how it lost a husband or a father. The ordinary day felt by its end like the last quiet breath before a long plunge into cold water, and she went to bed early that night, fully dressed beneath her nightgown, waiting for the house to fall silent around her. She went to the estate office at midnight, when the house had gone fully silent, and even the dogs had stopped pacing the hall below, and she went entirely alone. The ledgers from the year of the collapse were kept in a locked oak cabinet in the corner of the office, the key for which she had taken, 3 careful days earlier, from a hook in the housekeeper's pantry that no one thought to guard because no one in the household had ever imagined the Duchess herself would want it badly enough to take it. Her single candle threw long, trembling shadows across columns of numbers that told, slowly and in painstaking detail, a story she had begun in her bones to fear long before she found the proof of it. In January, 6 weeks before the February collapse, an entry recorded the cancellation of a standing order for elm support timber, the flexible, forgiving wood every quarryman in 3 counties knew was safest for bracing an unstable gallery, and its quiet replacement with cheaper oak, stiff and brittle, and prone to snapping under sudden, shifting pressure rather than bending to absorb it. The saving recorded in the margin was modest, £40, perhaps slightly less. Beside the entry, in a hand she now recognized with a sick lurch as the old Duke's own, unmistakable and slanting, was a single chilling notation for C's wedding settlement. C. Caroline, the old Duke's eldest daughter, Garrick's elder sister, married that same spring in a ceremony Lynette had heard described more than once at county gatherings in tones of pure admiration as the most lavish wedding Hallowcroft had hosted in a full generation, with garlands and a feast and silk ordered specially from London. 7 men had died, she understood now with a clarity that made her stomach turn, so that a wedding could be paid for in cheap oak instead of safe elm. Further back in the ledger, beneath the pension records, she found a second set of documents she had never been meant to see, folded together and tied with string as though someone had once tried to make them small enough to forget. Each widow had signed a private agreement. Trembling signatures she could see even now, dated the very week of each husband's funeral, promising never to speak of the true cause of the collapse, on pain of immediate eviction and the total forfeiture of the pension that kept their children fed. Agnes Coombs' signature was there among them, shaky, barely legible, dated 4 days after her husband Thomas was buried in the churchyard at the edge of Thorn Hollow. Lynette sat alone in the dark, candlelit office with 7 men's deaths spread across the desk in her husband's family's own careful, damning handwriting, and she understood, finally and completely, exactly what Garrick had inherited along with his title 3 years ago, and exactly what he had chosen, quietly and deliberately, every single day since, to protect. She read each name aloud to the empty room, softly, as though saying them might undo some small portion of the silence that had buried them for 3 years. Thomas Combe, Agnes's husband, 34 years old. Walter Hask's elder brother, Edmund, 29. 5 others, names she did not yet know but would soon learn as well as her own. Men who had walked into Greystone Quarry on an ordinary February morning, expecting an ordinary day's wage, and who had been crushed beneath cheap oak that snapped instead of elm that bent, because £40 had mattered more to a dying man's father than 7 lives. She found, tucked behind the silencing agreements, a single sheet that nearly stopped her heart entirely. A letter, unsent, in Garrick's own hand, dated less than a year into his dukedom, addressed to no one, written, it seemed, only for himself. In it he had begun, haltingly, to draft a confession. "I have found my father's order for the timber," it read in handwriting that grew increasingly unsteady across the page. "I do not know what to do with what I have found. If I speak it, I destroy us all. If I do not, I become him." The letter ended mid-sentence, the quill stroke trailing off the edge of the page as though he had set it down and never picked it up again. Lynette folded the unsent letter back into the cabinet exactly as she had found it, her hands no longer trembling but perfectly, terribly steady, because she understood now that she was not confronting a villain in the morning. She was confronting a frightened, grieving man who had inherited a sin not his own, and had spent 3 years drowning quietly inside it, rather than asking the one person in the house who might have helped him find a way out. That understanding did not excuse what had happened to Eli or to Agnes or to the 7 widows who had signed their silence away over fresh graves. But it told her, as she blew out the candle and crept back to bed in the last hour before dawn, exactly what kind of conversation the morning would require. Not an accusation thrown like a stone, but a door finally held open. She did not sleep again that night. She lay in the dark beside Garrick with the iron key still warm from her own pocket, listening to the house settle and creak around her, the way old houses do in the deepest hours, and she found herself strangely grieving. Not for the marriage she feared she might be about to break, but for the 3 lost years in which she and Garrick might have carried this together, had either of them ever once found the courage to ask the other the right question at the right moment. She thought of Agnes's trembling signature, dated 4 days after a funeral. She thought of the unsent letter's final unfinished sentence, the quill stroke trailing off into nothing. And she understood, watching the grey light finally begin to creep beneath the curtains, that whatever came next, she would not be the one in this marriage who let a sentence go unfinished. Before she rose that morning, she did one more thing in the privacy of the dark office, something she would not fully explain to herself until much later. She copied in her own clear hand by candlelight every essential figure from the timber order and every name from the silencing agreements onto a single fresh sheet of paper and folded it small and tucked it into the lining of her own jewelry case rather than leaving it only in the locked cabinet where it had sat hidden for 3 years already. She did not yet know what she would do with that copy. She knew only that a truth left in only one set of hands, behind only one lock, in only one house, was a truth that could still, with enough determination from the wrong person, be made to disappear again. The candle had nearly guttered to nothing by the time she finally locked the cabinet and slipped the iron key back into her pocket. She paused at the office door for a long moment before opening it, looking back once at the desk where 7 men's deaths and 1 family's careful cowardice now lay folded neatly away in a drawer, and felt the strange, hollow weight of a woman who has just learned something that cannot be unlearned. There would be no comfortable version of the morning ahead. She understood that fully now, standing in the doorway with the last of the candlelight dying behind her. Whatever she said to Garrick when the sun rose, it would change the shape of her marriage permanently, for better or for worse, and there was no longer any path back to the easy, obedient silence she had carried for 3 years like a well-fitted glove. She confronted him the next morning in the breakfast room, sunlight cutting cold and bright through the tall windows. The ledger closed beneath her arm like a blade she had not yet fully decided to draw across the table between them. "I know about the timber," she said. No greeting, no softening, no careful approach of the kind a well-bred duchess was meant to take with her husband. "I know about Caroline's wedding settlement. I know what the widows signed and why, and what it cost them to sign it." Garrick set down his coffee cup with exaggerated deliberate care, the care of a man holding himself together by inches and aware that one wrong movement might shatter the entire arrangement. For a long, terrible moment he said nothing at all, and Lynette watched something in his face crumble that she had never once seen crumble in 3 years of marriage. The composure that had governed every hour of his public life since the day she'd met him, the careful wall built so completely it had fooled even her, his own wife, for years. "My father did that," he said finally, his voice rough and low. "Not I. Your father is dead, Garrick. You are not. You renewed every one of those silencing agreements yourself, with your own signature after his death. You sent Hob Tanner's entire family away in disgrace because he spoke a single sentence of truth at a christening. You let Mr. Pruitt walk that lane like a dog set to guard a grave, and you let him raise his hand to a child to keep that grave undisturbed." "If it comes out," Garrick said, and his voice broke audibly on the word out, cracking like ice underfoot, "the title is finished entirely. The debts my father left behind will fall due all at once, every creditor in Carlisle descending in a single season, because there will be no Hallowcroft left standing with any credit to protect. I'm not protecting my own pride, Lynette. I'm protecting 800 people across this estate who have nowhere else in the world to go if this house falls." Lynette stared at him across the breakfast table, and for the first time in 3 years she understood the precise shape of his cage, and understood too that it was, in its own twisted way, also a kind of love, warped by fear into something that was slowly crushing the very people it claimed so desperately to be saving. "Then we will find another way to protect them," she said, her voice steady even as her heart hammered. Because this way is killing them slowly, one frightened child at a time, and you have known it for 3 years. There is no other way. Garrick's hands had curled into fists on the white tablecloth, the knuckles pale. I have spent every night since my father's funeral searching for one linnet. I have written and burned a dozen letters of confession. I have sat in that chapel until the candles guttered out, asking what a man is supposed to do when the only way to save the living is to keep lying about the dead. I found nothing. I am not the villain in this house, whatever you have decided to believe of me this morning. I have not decided you are a villain, Linnet said, and her voice softened, just slightly, enough that he looked up at her properly for the first time since she had entered the room. I found the letter you never sent, Garrick. The one in your own hand, in the cabinet, that stops mid-sentence. I know you have been drowning in this for 3 years. I know you did not build the cage, but you have been guarding it, and a man with a key in his pocket is no longer only a prisoner. He is also, whether he chooses it or not, a kind of jailer. Garrick flinched at that, visibly, as though she had struck him. For a long moment, the only sound in the breakfast room was the clock on the mantel and the distant clatter of the kitchen below. Ordinary household sounds continuing on exactly as they had every morning for 3 years, indifferent to the quiet collapse happening at the table above them. What would you have me do? He said finally, quietly, all the iron gone out of his voice. That does not end with every family on this estate losing their home. I do not know yet, Linnet admitted, but I know it begins with the truth, not with another signature pressed out of a grieving woman's hand. Give me time, Garrick. Do not send Pruitt to silence anyone else while I find it. He did not answer, but he did not refuse her either, and Linnet rose from the table understanding that his silence for once was not a wall but a door left ajar, and she intended to walk through it before he found the courage or the fear to close it again. She paused at the threshold of the breakfast room and turned back once because there was one more thing she needed him to hear, and she suspected she would not find the nerve to say it again if she waited. I'm not leaving you over this, Garrick, she said quietly. I want you to understand that clearly, whatever happens in the days ahead. I'm angry. I'm frightened for those families. But I married a man who stood at windows and could not sleep, and I always wondered why. Now I know, and I find I do not love you less for it. I love you less for the silence, not for the sin you did not commit. There is still time to choose differently than your father chose, and I intend to stand beside you while you do it, not behind you and not against you. He looked up at her then with an expression she had never once seen on his face in 3 years of marriage. Not the composed mask, not the haunted grief, but something rawer and more hopeful than either. The look of a drowning man who has just felt for the first time a hand close around his wrist. He said nothing. He did not need to. Linnet left the breakfast room with that look carried carefully in her chest like a lit candle shielded against the wind, and walked out into the cold morning already certain of where her next steps would take her. She stopped in the corridor outside the breakfast room and found Charlotte waiting there, pale and clearly listening, having no doubt heard fragments of raised voices through the heavy door. Is it true? Charlotte asked quietly, her hands twisted together in front of her. What I overheard? About the quarry? Linnet considered for a moment, denying it, the old habit of estate silence rising automatically to her tongue. She set it aside instead. It is true, she said simply. And I'm going to make certain it is finally told properly, Charlotte, whatever it costs this family. I would rather you hear it from me, plainly, than piece it together from servants' whispers, the way I very nearly did myself. Charlotte's eyes filled, but she nodded, and something passed between the two women in that cold corridor that had not existed between them before. Not quite trust yet, but the first fragile beginning of it. She went back to Thorn Hollow alone, on foot, the very next afternoon, without bread this time, without Pruitt trailing behind her, and entirely without her husband's permission. Agnes opened the door only because she recognized the particular sound of Linnet's voice through the wood, promising, low and urgent, that she had come to end the silence this time, not enforce it further. Inside, by the low, struggling fire, Eli sat with his collarbones still bruised in faded yellow, and Linnet finally understood the second, deeper secret, the one Agnes had been most afraid of revealing of all. Mr. Pruitt struck him, Agnes said, the words tumbling out now in a flood, like a dam finally giving way after years of strain. Because Eli told another boy in the lane what his father truly died of. He'd heard old Hob Tanner say it once before they sent him away, and he repeated it, not knowing, not understanding what it would cost. Pruitt told me himself, standing right there in that doorway, that next time it would be the cottage burned, not the boy bruised. Your Grace, I signed that paper because I was starving and grieving with 3 children to feed, and I have lived every single day since wondering if I sold my husband's name and his memory for nothing more than a loaf of bread. Lynette knelt on the cold floor and took the boy's small, cold hands in both of hers, holding them as though she could warm away 3 years of fear with the pressure of her own grip. "You did not sell anything, Agnes," she told her, fierce and certain, her voice cracking with the force of it. A frightened, grieving woman protecting her children from a man with absolute power over her life and her home is not a traitor to her husband's memory. She is exactly the opposite. The men who built that cage around you are the only ones who should carry any shame at all, and I intend to see that they finally do. She walked the length of Thorn Hollow that grey afternoon, cottage by cottage, knocking on each weathered door herself, and found the same story repeated 7 times over in 7 different trembling voices. Widows who had signed away the truth, not from greed, but from sheer terror. Children quietly taught from infancy to flinch at the sight of a grey coat on the lane. An entire small community held silent for 3 long years by a fear carefully dressed up, by clever men as generosity freely given. By dusk, with the sky bruising purple over the moor, Lynette had 7 names, 7 painful testimonies given freely and without threat, and the beginnings of a plan that would either save Hallowcroft from itself or burn the whole careful structure of it to the ground in the trying. The last cottage she visited belonged to a woman named Sarah Pell, whose husband had been the youngest of the 7 men killed, only 22, married less than a year when the gallery came down. Sarah had not signed her grief away quietly. She told Lynette, in a voice gone flat and worn smooth by 3 years of swallowing it, that she had once tried to walk to the county seat herself, to speak with a magistrate, on foot in winter, with her infant daughter wrapped against the cold, only to find Mr. Pruitt waiting for her at the crossroads, as though he had known her plan before she had finished forming it. He had not threatened her that day. He had only reminded her, gently, almost kindly, exactly how many small mercies the estate currently extended to a widow with no other family and no other roof, and exactly how quickly mercies could be withdrawn. She had turned around and walked home in the snow, and she had never tried again. Lynette carried that story back up the lane with her, like a stone in her chest, heavier than all 6 of the others combined, because it told her something the ledgers alone never could have, that the silence over Thorn Hollow had not simply happened, the way weather happens. It had been maintained, actively and continuously, by a man paid specifically to maintain it, watching every road out of the village as carefully as he watched every door within it. She did not go straight back to the hall. She stood instead at the edge of the lane where it forked toward Greystone Quarry itself, half a mile distant, its dark mouth just visible against the fading light like a wound that had never properly closed. She had never once walked that final half mile in 3 years of marriage, had never once stood at the place where 7 men had died so that a wedding could be paid for in cheaper wood. She walked it now, alone, in the last grey light of the day, and stood at the collapsed eastern gallery with the wind pulling at her cloak, and made herself a quiet, private promise that whatever it cost her, whatever it cost Hallowcroft, those 7 names would not stay nameless any longer. The quarry floor was littered still with broken stone and the rotted remains of old timber scaffolding, untouched, it seemed, since the very day of the collapse, as though no one in 3 years had found the courage to come and clear it away. Lynette picked her way carefully across the rubble until she found it, half buried beneath fallen rock at the gallery's collapsed mouth, a section of support beam, splintered cleanly across its width in a single brutal break. The kind of break she now understood from her hours with the ledger that brittle oak made and pliant elm never would. She knelt and touched the broken wood with her bare hand, cold and rain-softened beneath her fingers, and felt, more than she had felt at any ledger entry or any trembling signature, the full and terrible weight of what 40 saved pounds had actually cost. She carried a fragment of that broken beam home with her in her cloak pocket, small enough to hide, heavy enough to remember, and set it on the desk in the estate office that very night beside the ledger, where it would remain unmoved until the day the whole truth finally stood in daylight. She was not entirely alone at the quarry that evening, though it took her a long moment in the failing light to realize it. A figure stood at the far edge of the gallery, half hidden by a collapsed timber strut, and her heart leapt into her throat before she recognized the shape of him. Sarah Pell's young nephew, a boy not much older than Eli, sent often to gather kindling on the moor near the old workings. He had been coming here alone for 3 years, he told her shyly, to leave small stones stacked in a careful cairn near the spot where his uncle had died, the closest thing to a proper marker the family had ever been permitted. Lynette helped him add 1 more stone to the cairn before she left, and promised him, as she had promised the row of graves in the churchyard, that there would be a true memorial standing there before the year was out, one that no steward would ever again have reason to walk past and pretend not to see. Mr. Pruitt found her in the estate office 2 nights later, the ledger open before her once more, the candle burned low and guttering, and his long grey coat dark and dripping with rain from the storm rolling in off the moor. "His Grace will not thank you for this, Your Grace," he said, closing the heavy door behind him with a quiet, deliberate click that sounded in the otherwise silent house uncomfortably like a lock turning somewhere final. "Some things are kept buried for good reason. I've always believed that, and I have done what was necessary to keep it so." "You struck a child," Lynette said, not looking up from the page in front of her, her voice flat and cold as the rain outside. "There's no reason in this world good enough to justify that, and you know it, or you would not need to justify yourself to me now. I protect this estate." Pruitt's voice was flat, almost bored, the practiced voice of a man who had repeated this particular line to himself so many times across 11 years that it had long since stopped sounding, even to his own ears, like the lie it plainly was. "I have protected it for 11 years, doing the difficult, necessary work his Grace and his father before him were always too proud or too frightened to do themselves. Without me standing watch on that lane, that boy's whole family is in the gutter by spring, and so are a dozen others." "Without you," Lynette said, finally raising her eyes to meet his directly unflinching. "That boy might not flinch every single time a man in a long grey coat walks past his window. That is not protection, Mr. Pruitt. That is fear, manufactured and maintained, and you have made a profitable career of it." She told him then, calmly and without raising her voice, exactly what she had already done in the 2 days since leaving Thorn Hollow. Copies of every ledger entry, carried personally to the rectory and entrusted into the keeping of the vicar, a man with no estate debts of his own to protect and no reason at all to remain silent. 7 written testimonies signed not under any threat this time, but freely and willingly, properly witnessed and sealed with wax. A letter, already dispatched by that morning's post, addressed directly to the county magistrate, a distant cousin of her own Marrow family, who owed her father's house an old and unrepayable debt of honor from decades past. Pruitt's careful composure broke for the first time since he had entered the room, his face draining of all its practiced calm. "You will destroy this entire family, Your Grace, everything, the title, the tenants, all of it." "No," Lynette said, rising slowly from the desk to face him fully, standing taller than her own frame seemed to allow. "I am going to save this family from the very thing you and the old Duke built it into, brick by careful, cowardly brick. Pack your things tonight, Mr. Pruitt. You no longer walk these lanes, and you never will again." For a moment she thought he might simply refuse, the way a man refuses an order from someone he has spent 11 years quietly believing held no real authority over him at all. His jaw worked. His hand, she noticed, had drifted toward the door as though calculating whether Garrick himself might still be roused to overrule her. But something in her face must have told him the calculation would not go the way he hoped, because the hand fell still again, and the last of his composure went out of him like a candle pinched between 2 fingers. "You do not understand what you are unleashing," he said, quieter now, almost pleading, the bored flatness gone entirely from his voice. "I did not enjoy what I did to that boy, Your Grace. I want you to know that. I have a family of my own to feed, the same as every soul in Thorn Hollow. I did what His Grace's father asked of me, and then what His Grace himself permitted, because it was the work in front of me, and because I told myself every single year that it spared more suffering than it caused." "That is what every jailer tells himself," Lynette said, not unkindly, though her voice did not soften either. I do not doubt that you believed it, Mr. Pruitt. I do not even doubt entirely that some part of it was true. But a child wears the bruise of your belief on his collarbone, and a widow has spent 3 years wondering if she sold her husband's memory for bread. Whatever comfort your reasons gave you, they gave none at all to Thorn Hollow. He left within the hour, his trunk, loaded onto a cart in the rain by lantern light, and Lynette stood at the office window, watching the lantern bob away down the long drive until the dark and the storm swallowed it entirely. She felt no triumph in the watching, only a kind of grim, exhausted relief, the relief of a woman who has finally pulled a single thorn from a wound that would take far longer than one night to properly heal. Somewhere beyond the rain-streaked glass, 11 days still stood between her and the magistrate's carriage, 11 days in which Garrick would have to decide, finally and for himself, which kind of man he intended to be. Garrick found her there at the window not long after, drawn, he admitted quietly, by the sound of the cart leaving and the strange silence that followed it through the house. He did not ask what she had done. He seemed somehow already to know, reading it in the set of her shoulders and the open ledger still glowing faintly by candlelight on the desk behind her. I should have dismissed him myself years ago, he said, coming to stand beside her at the cold glass. I told myself I kept him on because the estate needed continuity. The truth is, I kept him on because he made the silence easier to bear, and I was a coward for it. Lynette did not contradict him. She simply took his hand in the dark, the broken fragment of quarry timber still sitting on the desk behind them like a small patient witness, and together they watched the last of the lantern light vanish into the storm, the first true silence between them in 3 years that did not feel, for once, like something either of them was hiding from the other. In the days that followed, before the magistrate's carriage ever reached the drive, Garrick did something Lynette had not asked of him and had not expected. He rode to Thorn Hollow himself, alone and without announcement, and went door to door down the very lane Pruitt had once patrolled, listening to each family in turn, often saying very little, only listening, the way a man listens when he has finally understood that listening is the one thing he owes and has never once properly given. He came home each evening grey with exhaustion and said almost nothing of what he had heard, but Lynette noticed that the haunted set to his jaw, the one she had mistaken for ordinary grief in their first year of marriage, had begun, very slowly, to loosen. The magistrate arrived at Hallowcroft Hall 11 long days later, his carriage rolling up the gravel drive in the grey morning light, and the house that had held its breath for 3 entire years finally exhaled all at once into open chaos. Garrick met Lynette in the long gallery before the carriages drew fully to a halt, his face the colour of old paper, his hands clasped so tightly behind his back, his knuckles had gone white. "You sent for him without telling me, without so much as a word of warning. I told you 3 weeks ago at this very breakfast table that I would find another way," Lynette said, standing her ground beside the tall gallery window. "I never once promised you would enjoy watching me find it, Garrick. Only that I would. They could strip the title entirely. The debts will fall due whether the truth comes from your own mouth, freely given, or from someone else's, forced out of you. I have already spoken with the vicar, with the magistrate's own clerk, and with the bank in Carlisle that holds your late father's debts. There is a profound difference, Garrick, between a duke ruined by his father's crimes and a duke who chose, every day for 3 years, to cover them. One man is pitied by history, the other is despised by it. You still have a few minutes left to choose which man walks into that drawing room this morning." For a long, suspended moment he said absolutely nothing, and Lynette watched 3 years of careful, practiced silence war openly with the frightened, decent man trapped somewhere beneath it. Then something in him finally gave way entirely. Not a collapse, but a release. The particular unclenching of a body that has finally set down a weight it has carried for far too long without rest. He walked into the drawing room ahead of her that morning, not behind her as protocol and habit would have dictated, and when the magistrate asked him directly and plainly about the cancelled timber order, about the silencing agreements signed over freshly dug graves, about Hob Tanner's quiet exile to a distant parish, Garrick Hallowcroft told the truth in his own unsteady voice, standing in front of his own assembled household, for the very first time in 3 long years of careful, exhausting silence. Charlotte wept openly into her handkerchief. The housekeeper stood frozen and pale in the doorway, one hand pressed to her mouth. And somewhere far beyond the tall windows Word was already travelling fast down the lane to Thorn Hollow on the lips of stable boys and dairymaids, that the long silence over Greystone Quarry had finally, irrevocably, broken wide open. The magistrate, a stern but fair-minded man named Justice Aldrich Penrose, listened to the full account without interruption, his pen scratching steadily across his ledger as Garrick spoke. When the confession was finished, he set down his pen and studied the room for a long moment. The weeping sister, the frozen housekeeper, the Duke standing in the center of his own drawing room with nothing left to hide behind. "You understand, Your Grace," Penrose said at last, "that I am bound to report every word of this to the Crown's office in Carlisle, and that the consequences may well include the forfeiture of this title." "I understand it entirely," Garrick said, and his voice, though still unsteady, did not waver from its course. "I would rather lose the title honestly than keep it dishonestly for one more season." It was Linnet who spoke next, stepping forward to stand beside her husband rather than behind him. "Justice Penrose, I would ask the court to weigh one fact carefully before any judgment is rendered. The crime against those 7 men belongs to a dead man who can no longer answer for it. The crime of the silence belongs in part to this Duke. But it was this Duke who ended it, of his own will, before any magistrate forced his hand. I sent for you, sir, not to destroy this house, but because I believed, and still believe, that the truth and the title might yet survive together, if the court is willing to let a guilty man's son prove himself capable of something his father never was." Penrose said nothing for a long moment, his gaze moving between husband and wife with the careful weighing of a man who had spent 30 years learning to separate genuine remorse from performance. Then he closed his ledger with a quiet, decisive snap. "I will carry your words to Carlisle exactly as you have spoken them, Your Grace," he said to Linnet, and something in his tone, though still formal, had warmed by several careful degrees. "What the Crown's office decides will not be mine to determine, but I will say this much plainly before I leave this room. It is a rare house indeed, where the Duchess does more to save it than the Duke ever did to bury it." Before the magistrate's carriage departed that afternoon, a second visitor arrived at Hallowcroft Hall, one Linnet had not expected and had not summoned. Agnes Combe stood at the great front door in her best black dress. Eli's hand gripped tightly in her own, having walked the full mile from Thorn Hollow the moment word reached the village that the truth had finally broken open in the big house. She had come, she said, not to plead and not to accuse, but simply to stand in the hall where her husband's death had once been signed away in ink, and to be seen, openly, as exactly who she was, a widow who had survived. Garrick crossed the long gallery to meet her himself, in front of the magistrate, in front of his own weeping sister, and bowed to her as he had never once thought, in 3 years, to bow to any tenant on his land. "I am sorry, Mrs. Combe," he said simply, and the words, plain as they were, seemed to cost him more than any speech he had ever given in Parliament. Agnes did not answer him in words. She only nodded once and let her son finally, fully, stop hiding behind her skirts. Justice Penrose, watching the small scene unfold in the gallery before his own departure, made a note in his ledger that he would later read aloud, unprompted, in his report to Carlisle, that he had witnessed in his 30 years on the bench a great many confessions made under threat of exposure, and very few made, as this one had been, before exposure had ever fully arrived. It was that distinction, more than any single fact in the timber order or the silencing agreements, that would ultimately weigh heaviest in the Crown's office's final judgment of the Hallowcroft name. As the magistrate's carriage finally rolled away down the long drive in the fading afternoon light, Linnet stood with Garrick on the front steps of the hall, neither of them speaking for a long while. The house behind them, for the first time in 3 years, felt to her less like a place holding its breath and more like a place that had simply, finally exhaled. "I do not know what Carlisle will decide," Garrick said quietly, watching the carriage shrink toward the gates. "I do not know if I will still be a duke by midsummer." Linnet slipped her arm through his, the cold evening air sharp against her face, and found that the uncertainty no longer frightened her the way it might have a fortnight earlier. "Whatever they decide," she said, "you will be a man who finally told the truth in front of his own household, rather than one more Hallowcroft who let it die quietly behind a locked door. I find I would rather be married to that man, whatever title he carries or does not." Spring came to Thorn Hollow that year, with new slate roofs fitted to the oldest cottages along the lane, and a tall stone memorial raised at the edge of Greystone Quarry itself, 7 names carved into granite deep enough, the stonemason promised, to outlast 100 hard winters and more. The estate did not escape the truth entirely unscathed, nor should it have. Garrick surrendered a substantial portion of the Hallowcroft fortune to settle his late father's debts honestly and openly for the first time, and the county that had once praised the old duke's quiet generosity now spoke in lower and more careful voices at dinner tables across 3 shires of the harder truth beneath it. But the magistrate, weighing a son's full and voluntary confession fairly against a father's original crime, allowed the title itself to stand, and allowed Garrick the chance Linnet had argued so fiercely for in that drawing room. Not forgiveness handed freely and without cost, but the far harder, far truer grace of being permitted slowly to earn it back. Mr. Pruitt was tried before the same magistrate for the assault on the boy, and left the county entirely in open disgrace, his 11 long years of careful, quiet cruelty finally unraveled by 7 brave signatures and 1 stubborn duchess who simply would not be turned away from a slammed and bolted door. The Crown's office in Carlisle, weighing Justice Penrose's full report alongside Garrick's voluntary confession, ultimately allowed the Hallowcroft title to remain, on the condition that the estate's accounts be open to independent inspection for a full decade, and that a portion of the family's remaining fortune be set aside permanently for the education and welfare of every child in Thorn Hollow whose father had died in the collapse. Garrick accepted every condition without argument, signing the agreement in the same estate office where Linnet had once found his unsent letter of confession folded behind a stack of lies. He kept that old letter still, she knew, tucked now into the front of the very first ledger any visiting tenant was shown, a reminder he had chosen, deliberately, never to hide again. Hob Tanner's family was found, after some searching, in the distant parish where they had been quietly exiled, and Garrick wrote to them personally, inviting them home to Thorn Hollow with an apology that named, plainly and without excuse, exactly what had been done to them and why. Old Hob wept at the kitchen table reading it, Agnes told Linnet later, and then he laughed, a rusty, disbelieving sound, and said he had never once in 3 years expected to see his own name spoken honestly by a Hallowcroft again. The memorial at Greystone Quarry was unveiled on a clear morning in late spring. The whole of Thorn Hollow gathered at the edge of the old eastern gallery where Sarah Pell's nephew had once stacked his lonely cairn of stones. Linnet stood beside Garrick as the cloth was drawn back from the granite, 7 names catching the morning light, and watched Agnes step forward, unbidden, to lay a single sprig of heather beneath her husband's name. Eli stood close at his mother's side, no longer flinching, no longer hiding, and when the small crowd began, hesitantly at first, and then with growing voice, to sing an old hymn the vicar had chosen, Linnet found she could not see the granite clearly anymore, for the tears standing in her own eyes. Garrick's hand found hers without either of them looking, and they stood together through the whole of the singing, husband and wife, in full view of everyone, with nothing left between them that needed to be hidden from the lane. Agnes Combe received her late husband's pension doubled by formal order, and her name cleared at last in the parish register, no longer remembered as a woman who had sold her silence for a loaf of bread, but honored instead as a widow who had survived a deep injustice and lived long enough to see it finally named aloud, in daylight, by the very family that had caused it. Eli stopped flinching at the sight of grey coats within the year entirely. He liked, Linnet noticed with quiet joy, to walk the lane up to the hall himself now, unafraid and unhurried, to bring her small bunches of wildflowers in exchange for the bread she still carried down to Thorn Hollow faithfully every single week, though no one walked 3 careful steps behind her, watching any longer. Garrick found Linnet in the estate office one warm evening. That following summer, the heavy oak cabinet unlocked now and standing open, the ledgers laid out plainly on the desk for any tenant who wished, at last, to see them with their own eyes. "I spent 3 years believing that silence was protection," he said quietly, coming to stand beside her at the desk. "You taught me, in the space of a single winter, that it was only ever a slower, crueler kind of harm." "I did not teach you anything, Garrick," Linnet said, taking his offered hand and holding it firmly in her own. "I simply would not stop knocking on doors that other people had decided, long before I arrived, should always stay closed." He turned the fragment of broken quarry timber over in his free hand. the one that had sat on the desk since the rainy night Pruitt left, worn smooth now by months of handling. "I want to keep this here," he said, "not hidden away. Here on the desk, where every steward after me will see it before he signs a single order. So no one in this house ever again decides that £40 is worth more than a man's life. And no one ever again has the comfort of forgetting that someone once thought it was." Linnet thought of Agnes's bowed head in the great hall, of Eli no longer hiding behind his mother's skirts, of 7 names now cut deep into granite at the edge of a quarry that would never again produce a single block of stone. She thought, too, of the slammed door on that first frozen afternoon, and of how very nearly she had let herself be turned away from it, the way 3 years of careful obedience had trained her to be turned away from almost everything that mattered. Years later, when their own children were old enough to ask about the stone memorial at the edge of the quarry and the carved names none of their playmates' families ever spoke of lightly, it was Lynette who told them the story first, plainly, the way she wished someone had told it to her 3 years sooner than she had been forced to find it herself. She told them about Agnes Coombs' slammed door and the bruise shaped like a man's hand, and the single half-formed word a frightened boy had nearly managed to say before fear closed his mouth again. She told them that silence, however kindly intended, however carefully dressed up as protection, was never truly safety for the people kept inside it, only safety for the people who benefited from their staying quiet. And she told them, last of all, that a closed door was never, in her experience, a reason to walk away, but only ever a reason to knock again, more carefully, more honestly, until someone finally found the courage to answer it. Outside the tall office window, the lane to Thorn Hollow lay open and golden in the long evening light, empty of watching shadows, and for the first time in 3 full years, no one at Hallowcroft was afraid anymore of who might be walking quietly down it. The end! Drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are.